The late afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across Maple Creek Lane, a street so tranquil it seemed sealed under a bell jar of suburban quiet. Lawn sprinklers ticked in rhythmic whispers, and the scent of freshly cut grass hung in the humid air. Arthur Vance was on his knees in his small garden, patiently coaxing a stubborn weed from the soil around his wife's prize-winning roses. He was a man made of quiet gestures and soft edges, a librarian whose world was bound by the Dewey Decimal System and the gentle turning of pages. His hands, though stained with earth, were not the hands of a fighter. They were the hands of a scholar, a widower, a father. That peace was shattered by a sound that didn't belong. The grating laugh of Ricky Malone. Ricky was a neighborhood malignancy, a young man who mistook cruelty for strength and fear for respect. He and his two shadows, lean and smirking, had cornered Arthur's son, Leo, at the end of the driveway. 16-year-old Leo stood frozen, his hand clutching the handlebars of his bicycle. A gleaming silver mountain bike that was his most prized possession. "Nice wheels, Leo," Ricky sneered, his voice slicing through the afternoon calm. "A little too nice for a pipsqueak like you. Think it's time you let a real man ride it." Leo's face was pale, his knuckles white on the grips. "Get away from me, Ricky." The words were brave, but his voice trembled, betraying the fear coiling in his stomach. Arthur rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees. His heart hammered a dull, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He saw the scene unfold like a slow-motion nightmare. Ricky shoving Leo backward, the boy stumbling, and the bike clattering to the pavement. Ricky's friends snickered, their eyes darting around, enjoying the public spectacle. Curtains twitched in the windows of the houses up and down the street. Mrs. Gable from next door paused her watering, her hose going limp in her hand. Mr. Henderson across the way froze mid-stride on his way to his mailbox. They were all watching. Arthur started walking toward them, his steps measured, deliberate. He felt their eyes on him, their silent, pitying judgment already forming. There goes Arthur Vance, they would think. Too soft to handle his own business. He stopped a few feet from the group, keeping his posture open, his hands visible. "Ricky," he said, his voice calm, level. It was the voice he used to quiet a restless child during story hour at the library. "That's my son's bike. Please give it back to him." Ricky turned, a look of theatrical disbelief on his face. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Or what, bookworm? You gonna shush me to death?" He picked up the bike, swinging a leg over the frame. It was too small for him, making his dominance look both brutish and pathetic. "This is mine now. A toll for living on my street." Arthur didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He simply held Ricky's gaze. "There's no need for this. Just let him have his bike back." It was Leo who broke. "Dad, just leave it," he hissed, his face burning with a humiliation so profound it was almost physical. He wanted his father to shout, to fight, to do something other than stand there like a patient statue absorbing insults. He wanted a father who was a lion, not a lamb. Ricky saw the boy's shame and fed on it. He looked from Leo's mortified face to Arthur's placid one. "Your old man's a coward, kid." He then turned his full attention to Arthur. With a sudden, vicious movement, he shoved Arthur hard in the chest. The push was unexpected, and Arthur, a man of books and not brawls, stumbled backward, his feet tangling. He fell to the ground, landing with a soft thud on his own manicured lawn. The final indignity was the sprinkle of grass clippings that dusted his shirt. Ricky laughed again, a triumphant cackle that echoed down the silent street. He wobbled away on the stolen bike, his cronies jogging behind him, their laughter trailing like exhaust fumes. Leo stared down at his father, his expression a terrible mixture of fury, disappointment, and shame. The neighbors slowly retreated behind their curtains, their silence a verdict. Arthur Vance had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. He lay there for a moment, the scent of crushed grass in his nostrils, the weight of his son's gaze heavier than any physical blow. Arthur drove to the police station with a cold, heavy knot in his stomach. The silence in the car was an entity of its own, thick and suffocating. Leo sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his profile a rigid line of teenage indignation. He hadn't said a word since Ricky had disappeared around the corner, his laughter still hanging in the air like a foul odor. The stolen bike was more than just metal and rubber. It was a symbol, and its theft was a public castration of his father's authority, and by extension, his own. Inside the station, the air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. A bored-looking officer with a thick mustache and a name tag that read SGT Miller sat behind a plexiglass barrier, typing with 2 fingers on a keyboard. He looked up as Arthur approached, his expression weary, as if their presence was just another tedious interruption in a long, slow day. Arthur explained the situation calmly and clearly, recounting the events without embellishment or emotion. He gave Ricky Malone's name, his address, and a description of the stolen bicycle. Miller listened with half an ear, his eyes occasionally glancing back at his computer screen. When Arthur finished, the officer sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of bureaucratic fatigue. "Mr. Vance," he began, leaning back in his squeaky chair. "Ricky Malone is a known troublemaker. We get calls about him all the time. But a stolen bike. Honestly, it's a he said, she said situation. Boys get into scuffles. Property gets borrowed." Arthur's calm began to fray at the edges. "He assaulted my son and he pushed me to the ground in front of my own home. There were witnesses." Miller picked at something on his sleeve, his gaze avoiding Arthur's. "Did you require medical attention? Did your son?" "No. Look, I'll file a report. We'll have a patrol car swing by his place when they have a spare moment. But you have to understand, we're dealing with burglaries, domestic disputes. Real crime. A kid's bike isn't high on the priority list." The dismissal was absolute. It wasn't just about a lack of resources. It was a fundamental denial of his worth, of his family's right to feel safe. He was being told, in the blandest possible terms, that his humiliation was insignificant, a minor annoyance not worthy of the system's attention. He was just another powerless citizen with a trivial problem. He took the offered report number on a small slip of paper and walked out, the officer's parting words, "Try to keep your boy out of trouble," echoing in his ears. The drive home was even quieter than the drive there. The knot in Arthur's stomach had tightened into a cold, hard stone. When they pulled into the driveway, the empty space where the bike should have been was a gaping wound. Inside the house, Leo went straight to his room and shut the door with a quiet click that was more damning than a slam. Arthur stood in the hallway, listening to the silence. He could feel his son's disappointment radiating through the wood of the door. Leo hadn't needed him to win a fight. He had needed him to try. He had needed to see that the world couldn't just take things from them without consequence. And in that, Arthur had failed him completely. The system had failed them, and in Leo's eyes, he had failed them too. He made dinner, a simple pasta dish that was usually Leo's favorite, but the boy didn't come out of his room. Arthur ate alone at the kitchen table, the second plate sitting cold and untouched across from him. The house, usually a sanctuary of warmth and memories of his late wife, Sarah, felt vast and empty. Every ticking clock, every creak of the floorboards, seemed to mock his inadequacy. He wasn't just a librarian, a widower. Tonight he was a coward, a man who couldn't protect his son's property, a man who couldn't even command the respect of a common street thug or a desk sergeant. His worth had been measured by the world and found to be negligible. The weight of that judgment, especially the unspoken judgment from his own son, was a heavier burden than he had carried in a very long time. Sleep offered no escape that night. Arthur lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the moon cast pale, skeletal shadows through the blinds. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the contempt in Ricky's face, the pity in his neighbor's eyes, and worst of all, the crushing disappointment in Leo's. The silence from his son's room was a constant, throbbing ache. Around 2 in the morning, he gave up. He slipped out of bed, his bare feet silent on the cool hardwood floor, and padded down the stairs and into the garage. The air in the garage was thick with the familiar, comforting smells of motor oil, sawdust, and damp earth. It was his space, a place of quiet tinkering and contemplation. But tonight, it felt like a tomb of forgotten things. He walked past the lawnmower, the neatly organized tool bench, and the stacks of old books waiting to be donated. He knelt down in the far corner, under a heavy workbench cluttered with half-finished projects. He reached deep underneath, his fingers brushing against cobwebs and dust until they found the rough, splintered edge of an old wooden footlocker. He dragged it out. It was heavy, not just with its contents, but with the sheer weight of memory. He ran a hand over the lid, tracing the faded initials S.V. carved into the wood. Sarah Vance. His Sarah. With a soft click, he undid the two brass latches. The hinges groaned in protest as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper, was a life he had buried long ago. On top lay a framed photograph of him and Sarah, taken more than 20 years ago. They were younger, almost unrecognizable. Sarah was laughing, her head thrown back, her hair a wild cascade in the wind. He was looking at her, a fierce, protective love in his eyes that he rarely saw in the mirror anymore. They were sitting on a gleaming Harley-Davidson, a machine that looked more like a beast of myth than a mode of transport. His arms, visible beneath a rolled-up sleeve, were covered in intricate tattoos that now remained hidden under the long-sleeved shirts of a librarian. He gently set the photo aside. Underneath it was a folded piece of leather, cracked and worn with age, but still supple. He lifted it out, its familiar weight settling in his hands. He unfolded it. It was a sleeveless leather vest. On the back was a large, embroidered patch. It wasn't the grinning skull of the local Iron Saints charter. It was a different emblem, one not seen in these parts for years. A solitary, stoic wolf's head against a backdrop of a compass rose. Below it, in archaic lettering, were the words Nomads MC. They were legends, a ghost chapter that answered to no one. Their members known for their unbreakable code and their quiet, lethal efficiency. They valued loyalty above all else. Arthur traced the intricate stitching of the patch with his index finger. Memories, sharp and vivid, flooded him. The roar of 100 engines, the smell of road dust and freedom, the unshakable bond of brotherhood. He had been one of them, not just a member, but a respected voice. They called him the Scholar because he was the one who could read the maps, both literal and metaphorical. He was the strategist, the thinker, the calm center in their chaotic world. Then he met Sarah, a brilliant, vibrant artist who saw past the leather and the reputation. She saw the man underneath, the quiet soul who loved poetry as much as the open road. When she became pregnant with Leo, she had asked him to make a choice. Not an ultimatum, but a gentle plea. "This life," she had whispered one night, her hand on her swelling belly, "it's too loud for a baby. I want our son to know the man I fell in love with, not the legend." He had made her a promise. He walked away. He traded the roar of the Harley for the rustle of turning pages, the nomadic life for a mortgage on Maple Creek Lane. He never regretted it, not for a second. He buried the Scholar and became Arthur Vance, father and husband. He tucked the vest back into the box, his movements slow and reverent. Beneath where it had lain was a small, velvet-covered box. Inside was a receipt. It was for a silver mountain bike, purchased 6 months before Sarah lost her battle with cancer. It was her last gift to Leo, bought with the money she had painstakingly saved from selling her paintings. "For his adventures," she had said, her voice weak but full of love. "So he always has a way to find his own road." That was why he hadn't fought. It wasn't weakness. It was the weight of that promise. Raising his fist would have been a betrayal of the quiet life he had sworn to build, the peaceful world Sarah had wanted for their son. But now that world had been invaded, and the last piece of her left for their boy had been desecrated. The quiet strength that had sustained him for years was now being tested in a way he had never anticipated. He closed the lid of the footlocker, the click of the latches echoing the closing of a chapter, and perhaps the opening of another. The following day dawned gray and oppressive, the sky a bruised purple that mirrored the mood in the Vance household. The world outside seemed to conspire in their humiliation. Ricky Malone, emboldened by his easy victory and the utter lack of consequence, treated the stolen bike like a trophy. He rode it up and down the main street of their small town, deliberately passing the library where Arthur worked, a sneering grin plastered on his face. He had taken a can of red spray paint and scrawled the word "rat" across the sleek silver frame, a crude, dripping tag that was a personal insult to both Leo and the memory it represented. The desecration was a public broadcast of his dominance and Arthur's impotence. For Leo, school was a gauntlet of whispers and mocking stares. News in a small town travels faster than fire. By lunchtime, the story of the confrontation had been twisted into a caricature of cowardice. "Heard your old man just fell over and cried," a jock named Cal taunted, shoving Leo against a locker. "Guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." A primal rage, born of shame and a desperate need to defend his father's honor, erupted in Leo. He threw a wild punch, connecting with Kyle's jaw. The ensuing fight was short and brutal. Leo, fueled by emotion rather than skill, was quickly overwhelmed. He came home that afternoon with a split lip and a blossoming black eye, the physical evidence of his social ruin. He didn't speak when he walked in. He just went to the kitchen, pulled an ice pack from the freezer, and sat at the table, pressing it to his swollen face. The silence was heavier than ever, thick with unspoken accusations and the bitter taste of defeat. Arthur stood in the doorway, his heart twisting into a tight, painful knot. He saw the cut on his son's lip, the defiant anger in his eyes, and knew this was his fault. His passivity had forced his son to fight the battle he himself had refused. The pressure was becoming unbearable. It wasn't just Ricky anymore. It was the entire community. As Arthur was tending to Leo's cut with a first aid kit, he glanced out the window and saw Mrs. Gable standing on her porch, ostensibly checking her mail, but her eyes were fixed on their house. She met his gaze for a fleeting second, and in that moment, he saw it all: pity, a touch of contempt, and the sad, head-shaking certainty that he was a man who couldn't protect his own family. Her judgment was a quiet, relentless pressure, reinforcing the narrative that he was weak. The walls of his quiet, ordered life were closing in. The promise he had made to Sarah felt like a cage. He had chosen peace, but the world had brought war to his doorstep. That evening, as he looked at his son, who was now retreating even further into a sullen silence, Arthur understood. He could not let this stand. He had to act. But violence was not his path. It would break his vow to Sarah and, more importantly, it would teach Leo the wrong lesson that might makes right. There had to be another way, a path forged not from aggression, but from the quiet strength he had cultivated for 2 decades. He had to show his son and himself that true honor wasn't about winning a fight, but about standing for what you believe in no matter the cost. His decision settled not with a bang, but with a quiet, solemn resolve. He would confront Ricky again, but on his own terms. The Broken Spoke was a dive bar on the edge of town, a place that perpetually smelled of stale beer, regret, and bleach. Its windows were grimy, and the neon sign flickered erratically, casting a sickly pink glow on the cracked pavement outside. It was Ricky Malone's court, the place where he held sway over a small kingdom of sycophants and losers. When Arthur Vance pushed through the swinging doors, a sudden, unnatural silence fell over the room. The handful of patrons, the bartender wiping a glass, even the tinny jukebox, everything stopped. Arthur, in his neatly pressed khaki pants and a simple button-down shirt, was as out of place as a prayer book in a brothel. At a corner table, surrounded by his usual cronies, sat Ricky. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise, which quickly morphed into a broad, mocking grin. He leaned back in his chair, basking in the attention of the entire bar. Well, look what the cat dragged in," Ricky announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "Come back for another lesson, old man?" His friends erupted in jeering laughter. Arthur ignored them. He walked steadily toward the bar, his gaze fixed on Ricky. He didn't look angry. He didn't look afraid. He looked resolute, his face a mask of calm determination. He stopped not at Ricky's table, but at the bar, a few feet away. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a plain, white envelope. It was thin, but carried an immense weight. He placed it gently on the sticky, scarred surface of the bar. The gesture was so deliberate, so quiet, that it amplified the tension in the room. "This is all I have," Arthur said, his voice even and clear, carrying easily through the silence. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact. "It was for my son's college fund. It isn't much, but I've been saving it for years." He slid the envelope across the bar toward Ricky. "It's yours. I won't report the theft. I won't cause you any more trouble. All I ask is that you give my son back his bike." It was the last thing his mother ever gave him. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the bar. This was not the confrontation they had expected. They had anticipated shouting, maybe a clumsy, pathetic fight. But this was something else entirely. It was an act of such profound, almost bizarre self-abasement that it stunned everyone, including Ricky. For a moment, the bully was speechless. He looked from the envelope to Arthur's unwavering eyes, searching for a trick, a hidden angle. He found none. All he saw was the raw, unvarnished truth of a father's sacrifice. But Ricky's mind was incapable of processing honor. He saw this not as strength, but as the ultimate form of weakness. He burst out laughing, a loud, braying sound that broke the spell. "You're kidding me," he sputtered, snatching the envelope. He tore it open and pulled out the contents, a thin stack of worn bills. He fanned them out, counting them with a theatrical flourish. "This is it? This is what your kid's future is worth." He pocketed the cash with a flourish. "Thanks for the donation, Pops. But the bike? I think I'll keep it. I'm getting attached." He crumpled the empty envelope and threw it back in Arthur's face. It fluttered to the floor like a dead leaf. The bar erupted in laughter again, louder this time, relieved to be back on familiar ground. Arthur Vance was a joke, a pathetic old man who had tried to buy back his honor and failed. Arthur simply bent down, picked up the crumpled envelope, and smoothed it out with his fingers. He tucked it back into his pocket. He had offered everything he had. He had chosen his son's love and his wife's memory over his pride. He had lost the bike, he had lost the money. But as he turned and walked out of the bar, his back straight and his head held high, he had not lost his dignity. He left behind a room full of mocking laughter, but he took his soul with him, intact. In a dark, secluded booth in the far corner of the Broken Spoke, away from the flickering lights and the cheap theatrics at the bar, sat three men. They were older, their faces etched with the kind of lines that aren't from laughter. They wore simple, unadorned leather jackets, devoid of any club patches, making them blend into the bar's grimy shadows. They were invisible by design, but their eyes missed nothing. They had been nursing their beers, speaking in low rumbles, when Arthur Vance had walked in. They watched the entire exchange with a quiet, predatory stillness. They were not locals. They were scouts for the Iron Saints Hells Angels charter from the next county over, men sent to observe the lay of the land, to gauge the character of the local players. They were judges of men, and their currency was not money, but respect. They saw what the others in the bar did not. They didn't see a weak man getting humiliated. They saw a father walk into the lion's den, unarmed and without pretense. They saw him offer up his last dollar, his son's future, not in exchange for his own safety, but for a memory, for a piece of his late wife's soul. They saw him absorb the ultimate insult, the theft of his sacrifice, and walk away not broken but whole. It was an act of quiet, profound honor that resonated deep within their own hardened code. In their world, a man's word and his willingness to sacrifice for his family were the highest virtues. Arthur Vance had just displayed both in their purest form. As the laughter in the bar died down and Ricky Malone preened like a king, one of the men, a grizzled giant with a thick, graying beard, pulled out an old flip phone. He pressed a single button for speed dial. He kept his voice low, a gravelly murmur that was barely audible over the renewed noise of the jukebox. "Breaker," he said, using the road name of the Iron Saints president. "It's Grizz. You're not going to believe what I just saw." He paused, listening. Some local punk, A nobody named Malone just shook down a civilian. But the civilian, there was something about him. He described the scene in sparse, efficient detail. The quiet entrance, the envelope of money, the story of the wife's last gift, the dignified exit. He relayed the facts without emotion, like a field report. The man on the other end, Breaker, was silent for a long moment. Grizz continued, his voice dropping even lower. The thing is, Breaker, the punk called him Vance. Arthur Vance. A heavy silence crackled over the line. The name hung in the air, charged with history. It was a name from the old stories, a name whispered with a kind of reverence among the old guard. Call the archives. Breaker's voice finally came through, a low, dangerous rumble. Check the Nomad rosters from 20-25 years back. Find out if the scholar ever settled down near here. Grizz grunted in affirmation. On it, he flipped the phone shut. The three men shared a look. A silent understanding passed between them. The local pecking order was about to be violently rearranged. The whispers had begun. The perception of the quiet librarian from Maple Creek Lane was undergoing a seismic shift, not among the gossiping neighbors or the indifferent police, but within a brotherhood of iron and leather, a world that had thought Arthur Vance was long gone, a ghost from a bygone era. They finished their beers in silence, paid their tab in cash, and walked out into the night, their purpose now clear. The scales of justice, ignored by the official law, were about to be balanced by an older, more unforgiving code. Dusk on Maple Creek Lane was usually a time of profound peace. The sky bled from orange to deep indigo, streetlights hummed to life, and the sounds of evening settled in. The distant chime of an ice cream truck, the murmur of televisions through open windows. But on this evening, a new sound began. It started as a faint, low vibration. A hum felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a sound that didn't belong in this quiet corner of the world. The vibration grew, coalescing into a distinct, rhythmic growl. It was the sound of thunder, but the sky was clear. Windows began to rattle in their frames. Dogs that had been dozing on porches suddenly sat up, whining, their ears flat against their heads. Neighbors peered out from their windows, their curiosity quickly turning to alarm. The sound was getting closer, deeper, multiplying. It was the unmistakable, ground-shaking roar of dozens of V-twin engines. Then they appeared, one by one at first, then in a flood, a river of chrome and black leather poured onto the street. Harley-Davidsons, custom choppers, and heavy-framed cruisers turned the corner in a disciplined, menacing formation. The single headlight of the lead bike cut a brilliant white path through the gathering twilight. Atop it sat a man who seemed carved from mountain granite. He was immense, with a long, graying beard braided into two sections and eyes that held the cold, hard wisdom of 1,000 miles of bad road. This was Breaker, president of the Iron Saints. Behind him, stretching back as far as the eye could see, was his army. They filled the street from curb to curb, their engines a deafening, unified chorus of raw power. They were not just a few bikers. It was the entire charter, reinforced by members from neighboring territories who had answered the call. The final count was 120 strong. They rolled past Arthur Vance's small, tidy house and continued down the block, their presence a terrifying, beautiful spectacle. When the lead bike reached the curb in front of Ricky Malone's dilapidated rental house, Breaker raised a single, gloved fist. In perfect, stunning unison, 120 engines were killed. The sudden, absolute silence was more shocking than the noise had been. It was a heavy, weighted silence, full of unspoken threat and immense potential energy. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bikers just sat on their machines, a silent, leather-clad legion. Their collective gaze fixed on Ricky's front door. They formed a perfect, intimidating blockade, sealing off the street. Lights flicked on in every house. Faces, pale with fear and confusion, pressed against the glass. The carefully constructed tranquility of Maple Creek Lane had been irrevocably shattered. This was not a random act of intimidation. This was a calculated display, a message being sent not just to one street punk, but to the entire community. It was a declaration that the rules had changed. An old power had been awakened, and it had come to collect a debt of honor. Breaker swung his leg off his bike, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that knows it has no natural enemies. He didn't walk toward Ricky's house. Instead, he turned and began to walk up the street, directly toward Arthur Vance's front door. The porch light flicked on, casting a warm, yellow glow. The door opened a crack, and Leo peered out, his face a mask of terror. He saw the mountain of a man approaching, flanked by two other grim-faced bikers, and he tried to slam the door shut. "Dad!" he choked out. Arthur appeared behind him, placing a calming hand on his son's shoulder. He looked past Leo, his eyes meeting Breaker's across the small lawn. There was no fear in Arthur's expression, only a deep, weary recognition. Breaker stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He didn't speak with aggression or menace. His voice, when it came, was a low, respectful gravel. "Arthur Vance," he said, the name sounding like an invocation. "We heard you were in town. Heard a man put his hands on you." He gestured for one of his men to come forward. The biker was carrying something with the reverence of a holy relic. It was an old, dusty leather cut. He handed it to Breaker, who held it up for Arthur to see. It was the nomad vest from the footlocker in the garage. "One of my boys was in the bar," Breaker explained, his eyes locked on Arthur's. He recognized the story, the name, the way you carried yourself. Made me remember the old tales. By now, neighbors had crept out of their houses, drawn by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They stood in small, silent clusters on their lawns, watching the impossible scene unfold. Breaker turned, his voice rising, addressing not just Arthur, but the entire assembled neighborhood. "You people," he boomed, his voice echoing in the silent street. "You see a librarian, quiet man. You think he's weak." He held the vest higher, turning it so the solitary wolf emblem was visible to all. "We see a legend. This is Arthur, the scholar Vance of the Nomads. A man whose word was iron. A man who walked away from this life for the love of a good woman and the promise of a son." The neighbors gasped. Mrs. Gable put a hand to her mouth. Mr. Henderson stared, slack-jawed. They were seeing their quiet, unassuming neighbor in a completely new light. Breaker's gaze found Leo, who was staring at his father with a dawning sense of awe. "Your father," Breaker said, his voice softening slightly. "He didn't back down from a fight today. He stood up for his wife's memory in the only way a man of true honor could. He offered his future for her past. He didn't throw a punch because the promise he made to your mother was more important than the pride some punk tried to steal from him. The truth, delivered by this terrifying, leather-clad herald, washed over the street. The story was no longer about a coward who fell down. It was about a king who had knelt for love. The reveal was complete. Arthur Vance was not the man they thought he was. He was infinitely more, and his brotherhood, a brotherhood he had left behind 2 decades ago, had just come to remind the world of that fact. A terrified face appeared in the window of Ricky Malone's house. The curtain twitched shut. He had seen the army on his lawn, heard the president of the Iron Saints declare his verdict. His reign of petty terror was over. Breaker gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. 2 of his largest men detached themselves from the silent ranks and walked calmly toward Ricky's house. They didn't bother with the front door. They went around to the side where a rickety garage stood. A single, decisive kick shattered the lock on the side door. The sound of splintering would cracking like a gunshot in the silent street. A moment later, they emerged, wheeling Leo's silver mountain bike. It looked pathetic and small in their massive hands, the crude red graffiti a glaring mark of desecration. They wheeled it across the street and laid it gently on Arthur's lawn, as if it were an offering. Then the real ceremony began. Breaker motioned, and several more bikers came forward. They carried clean rags, bottles of polish, and a small, professional toolkit. Right there, on the front lawn of 12 Maple Creek Lane, under the watchful eyes of the entire neighborhood, they began to restore the bike. It was a meticulous, almost reverent process. One man, whose hands were as thick as bricks, worked with surprising delicacy to buff out the scratches on the frame. Another used a solvent to carefully remove every last trace of the red spray paint, his movements precise and focused. A third checked the chain, oiled the gears, and tightened the brakes. They worked in near silence, the only sounds the soft whisk of cloth on metal and the quiet click of tools. It was more than a repair. It was an act of purification. They were cleansing the object of its violation, restoring not just the bike, but the honor that was attached to it. When they were finished, the bike gleamed under the porch light, looking newer than the day it was bought. They presented it to Leo, who took it with trembling hands, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He looked from the perfect, restored bicycle to his father, and finally he understood. Biker watched the scene, a flicker of satisfaction in his hard eyes. He then turned to Arthur. In a gesture of supreme respect, he began to unfasten his own vest, the president patch of the Iron Saints displayed proudly on the chest. He took it off and held it out to Arthur. "You're still one of us, scholar," he said gruffly. "You always will be. This is yours if you'll have it." The entire street held its breath. It was an offer of immense significance, a return to the brotherhood, an invitation back into the fold. Arthur looked at the offered vest, then at his son, then at the quiet house his wife had made a home. He gave a small, sad smile and gently shook his head. "I made a promise, Biker," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "My road is here now." Biker did not look offended. He looked like he understood completely. He nodded slowly, a deep and profound sign of respect. He put his vest back on. He then stepped forward and placed a heavy, gloved hand on Leo's shoulder. "Your father," he said, looking the boy squarely in the eye, "is a man of more honor than any of us will ever be. Don't you ever forget that." The community of onlookers, their fear now completely replaced by awe, watched as the last vestiges of their old judgment crumbled to dust. They were witnessing the crowning of a king they never knew they had. The work was done. The message had been delivered, honor had been restored, and a legend had been reawakened. Biker gave a sharp, two-fingered whistle that cut through the night. It was the signal, as 120 men swung their legs back over their motorcycles. With a second signal, a deafening simultaneous roar erupted as every engine fired to life. The sound was not one of aggression now, but of thunderous validation, a final, declarative statement. It was the sound of a promise kept, a brotherhood's loyalty made manifest. They didn't linger. Biker led the procession, pulling his bike into a slow, majestic U-turn. The river of chrome and leather began to flow back out of Maple Creek Lane, their taillights a constellation of red stars retreating into the darkness. The rumble slowly faded, from a roar to a growl, and finally back to a distant hum that was swallowed by the night. They left behind a street that was fundamentally and forever changed. The silence that returned was different from the one that had preceded them. It was not the silence of fear or judgment, but one of quiet contemplation and newfound respect. Ricky Malone was a ghost. His power, built on the illusion of fear, had been broken not by a punch, but by the weight of 100 silent witnesses and one man's unwavering dignity. No one on that street would ever fear him again. The neighbors slowly, quietly, retreated back into their homes, their minds reeling. They looked at the small, tidy house in the middle of the block differently now. It was no longer the home of the meek librarian, but the fortress of a quiet king. On the porch, Arthur and Leo stood together, the restored bicycle gleaming between them. The air was cool now, and the scent of gasoline and leather still hung faintly in the air, a strange perfume of honor. Leo leaned the bike carefully against the railing. He then turned and, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he met his father's eyes. The shame and disappointment were gone, replaced by a look of profound, unconditional love and awe. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father, holding on tightly. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered into his father's shoulder. "I get it now." Arthur held his son close, his own eyes stinging. He stroked the back of Leo's head. "There is nothing to be sorry for. he said softly. They stood there for a long time, two figures silhouetted in the warm glow of the porch light. The world had tested Arthur Vance. It had judged him, dismissed him, and tried to break him. But his strength, forged in a promise to the woman he loved and tempered by his devotion to their son, had proven unbreakable. He was still Arthur Vance, the quiet librarian from Maple Creek Lane. But he was no longer invisible. He was a pillar, a man whose quiet dignity had called thunder down from the mountains, a man whose worth was now, finally, understood by all. His honor was secure.